a simple AM regenerative receiver. Somewhat inspired by this George Dobbs book, but much simpler. Keep watching for a circuit, a parts list, a wiring diagram, and a demonstration. Here's a look at the receiver. Very simple, just 12 components. I've used drawing pins to mount the parts. Because these drawing pins have coloured tops on them, I've used a file to file away the paint, and that's made a good surface that takes solder easily. Not only is this simple, but it works with low impedance headphones or even a speaker, and no audio transformer required. Here is the circuit. Very little to it. The incoming signal comes via a low value coupling capacitor. The bigger the antenna, the lower the value the capacitor should be. And in some cases, especially where you've got strong local stations, it's better just to have the antenna wire near and not actually in contact with the antenna connection. Anyway, the incoming signal comes through. This is the front end tuned circuit comprising two variable capacitors in parallel. Actually just a single component, but it's ganged so the halves are connected up. And the inductor is a 470 microhenry inductor that's resonant with the variable capacitor over the AM broadcast band. The signal's tapped off with 10 turns of very thin wire. I'll show that in a moment. And that 10 turns is wound over the body of the main primary inductor. You can obtain that wire from old transformers, very small transformers that you might see in circuit boards, or you might be able to purchase it. The reason why it's so thin is so that you can fit the 10 or 12 turns over the body of the inductor with room to spare on the ends. That secondary coil couples the signal into the transistor, the first transistor of the receiver. One side is connected to earth and the other to base via a 10 nanofarad capacitor. This is a simple regenerative receiver. Instead of one transistor in the detector, I'm using two, which increases the gain. And you've got the incoming signal is coupled through to the first transistor, then amplified again, and the gain is very high. Here it looks like an audio amplifier circuit as well. But anyway, in this case, we're tapping RF through here, just through the 10 nanofarad isolating capacitor. A little bit of RF is applied back to the input. Not very much, only a little bit, as you can see, because this is just earthed and there's just a single loop that's near the main front end coil, and that causes the gain to increase. It's important that you can vary the feedback so you can get an optimum setting, especially if you're trying to receive weak signals.
Ice cream, donuts, souvlaki. I just think, the community will rally around with, traders, because it's so tough for them.
Yeah, I agree completely. Just been a great call and a great idea. If you are from the Ivanhoe,
There's a lower amount of feedback. I've got about a centimetre between the tuning coil and the feedback winding. As you can hear, the volume is much less.
I don't know if you're listening to Drive yesterday with Ali, but there were calls saying that if you want teachers to stay on the job, take a look at the contracts.
I'm not using a regeneration control. Some circuits use either a variable resistor or variable capacitor, but here I'm just using what was used in the early days of radio. Then it was called a swinging loop, and you would adjust the loop to near the tuned circuit, and then that would vary the coupling. If you wanted to, you could twist it like that. If you had it end on, that would lessen the coupling. The adjustment is more critical if the station you're trying to receive is weaker. You set it to just the point of oscillation. When it's oscillating, there's a whistle that you hear when you tune into and tune away from a station.
That's wonderful. Even just wave off that's like being a graduate. Yeah, definitely. Having to leave your house, having to see people.
But independent data commissioned by the drinks industry shows rapid deliveries, meaning from click to front door in under 2 hours, are less than 3% of total alcohol sales, and the peak time for same-day alcohol delivery is between 6 and 7 p.m. So the industry argues not exactly peak party time.
Unlike a lot of simple receivers, this will drive an 8 ohm speaker or headphones, which can be 8 ohm or higher impedance. They are just in the DC line of the circuit here, just in the collector circuit. The receiver is built in a nice wooden box that I got from a charity shop. One of the problems with these is the panels can be quite thick, and too thick for normal 3.5mm sockets. So what I've done is I've used a lined socket and taken out the outer housing, and the thread fits quite comfortably into the panel. While I'm talking about headphone sockets, this one is connected with the tip and the outer, and that is fine if you are using mono headphones or a mono speaker. But if you're just going to be using headphones like these, it is better to connect both sides in series. And you do that just by connecting the tip and the ring. The ring is the middle connection. That requires a stereo socket instead of the mono socket and an insulated front panel. You don't connect the common connection, and you just connect the left connection to one side and the right connection to the other, and that will put both halves of the headphones in series. And that will give you better sound in both ears. As for the power source, 9 to 12 volts, and it draws 10 or 11 milliamps. I should mention that this is just a regenerative receiver. There's another circuit that people sometimes use called a reflex receiver, where you've got the transistors being amplifying both RF and audio. That does require more components. You often see diodes there that detect the signal before sending the signal back to be amplified again, this time as audio. But some receiver circuits also have quite complicated coil arrangements, including audio transformers that you might not be able to get. So that's why I've kept it simple. There's no reflexing. It's just a regenerative circuit, but I think you'll still be amazed at the results that you can get with something so simple.
So the industry argues not exactly peak party time.
So what I'm going to play Don't Cry for Me, Argentine by Sinead O'Connor, actually.
Hunter alluded to that this morning, this track firming up.
Be remiss if I did not begin today by congratulating the Transport Workers Union on their long-standing advocacy for workers and their rights.
Jill in Clinton Hill, what can you hear, Jill? Great to have you on. Thanks for calling.
Right here is the wiring diagram. As you can see right there, drawing pins and a block of wood. And it's a similar arrangement to the circuit, going from left to right from the antenna to the speaker. Important thing is what I've got just there that I'm tracing, and that's the wire that I'm using to provide the feedback. That is this part of the circuit there. You may need to adjust the orientation a bit to get the best results. And at the right we've got the battery connections and the headphone connections. As for the parts list, I've tried to keep it simple. Often you can't buy parts individually anymore, so where possible I'm using 2-up, so that if you buy a pack then you're wasting less. And I've doubled up on things like the 100k resistor. They are the same, there's 2 of them, transistors and some of the capacitors as well. The most challenging part is probably the variable capacitor. That you can salvage out of an old radio. Might be a bit of trial and error with the connections that you're going to use. A capacitance meter will be a great help, and the inductor is just 470 microhenry inductor, or RF choke as they might be known. Most important is the front end, and particularly the inductor and variable capacitor. With the variable capacitor here, there's 3 connections. The middle one, it might be slightly longer on some variable capacitors, goes to earth, and the other 2 either side are smaller variable capacitors. These are actually ganged, so they're controlled by the same shaft. One of them goes up to about 140 picofarad, the other about 70 or 80. You need those to be in parallel because we need a maximum of about 200 or 220 picofarad. That's necessary to cover the full broadcast band. The coil here is 470 microhenry. You might see them sold as RF chokes. As an experiment, you could try maybe 70 or 80 turns on a ferrite rod. That could allow this receiver to operate without an external antenna, but because it's nice and small and they're quite cheap, I used the inductor here, 470 microhenry. You might notice it's very fine wire, but I've got a coil wound over its body. It's about 10 or 12 turns of very thin enamelled coppered wire. About the width of a human hair. You sometimes see it in small transformers on circuit boards, even RF chokes. You might even be able to buy it. But yeah, use the thinnest possible wire you can get, and when you are mounting it, make sure that you use a knife to strip the ends off, because it is covered in enamel which is insulated, which is good, so you don't have shorts between the turns, but at the end you do need a connection. So yeah, just use either a small knife or sandpaper to take the enamel off near the ends, and that way you can solder it properly onto either the pins or the lead. One of the sides of the coil here is actually connected to earth, so is the little coil, so that's actually connected to the same point, so you can use that as an anchor point. But the other side of the secondary coil, which I've called it, the one that you wind over the body of the first coil, that goes to one of the drawing pins here. It's very fine, you might be able to see it just there, and that drawing pin connects to a 10 nanofarad capacitor which goes into the base of the first transistor. So the function of that secondary coil is just to couple the signal as selected by the main coil, which is the 470 microhenry, and with the variable capacitor that forms a tuned circuit, picks off the signal, then it's amplified and detected. Other thing that's important to note is this wire here, yellow wire. Not just any wire, but it's important to provide regenerative or positive feedback. That is key to the performance of this receiver with so few parts. It feeds back a bit of the signal from the output, the collector of the second transistor, into the input, the base of the first transistor, and if you set it in a particular position, that feedback really increases the gain possible. If you move it away a bit, then the feedback drops off. Here I've got the antenna lightly coupled, outside HF antenna, and a short lead from the receiver just near the feed line. The stronger station is giving good speaker reception in a quiet room. As you heard, some of the stations are a bit weak on the speaker, so we'll just connect the antenna properly and should then be a bit louder.
Be continued and invested in, but with a broader approach potentially. The way to go forward was to develop a integrated. Now, what's
happening in Melbourne at the moment, but on a positive, I think it's a perfect outlet. I know your listeners, and I know I don't live that far, and ice cream, donuts, souvlaki, I just think, the community will rally around these, traders, because it's so tough for them.
Chocolate hummus, really? Chocolate hummus. Why? Why? 1300 222 774. Over 70 crocodiles have escaped a local croc farm in China, with local authorities warning villagers in Pengkun. Call him Red. And the US opened in 2022 the second charge, which she was in May this year, related to irregularities in Halep's athlete biological, extraordinarily gentle, to the point where, depending on interpretation,
One thing I should mention is when you are experimenting with little receivers, always use a speaker in a box. The audio is always much stronger than if you're just using the plain speaker in air. If you don't have a box, then use something like a cardboard milk carton, punch a few holes, put the speaker in there, and that should be a much better enclosure than if the speaker is in open air. And also, often the bigger the speaker, you'll get louder audio as well, as it's more efficient.
Now $7.60.
So that's been our 12-part receiver for the AM broadcast band. If you build it, let us know in the comments below, especially if you make any improvements. Enjoy these videos, Want to start in amateur radio? Well, check out my books, Ham Radio Get Started for USA readers and the Australian Ham Radio Handbook for those in Australia. For more information, visit my website vk3ye.com or search their titles on Amazon.